big powers have this obsession with themselves. It's like everything must revolve around me, and I think that's not very helpful. China is becoming stronger, and there is very little that the U.S. could do to stop that, so they need to find a way to coexist in the world. These are two very big countries. They speak different languages, they have different cultures, they have been living in different political systems. The inherent gap is already there. The Chinese people and the American people, they are all human beings. The people in China want a better life, they want affordable housing, to have some fun, a good beer after dinner. That's the same thing here in the United States.
How do Americans understand China?
Because of COVID, because of the tense relationship between the two countries, we have seen a dramatic decrease in terms of travel between the two countries. There are not many Chinese journalists based in the United States. There are not many journalists working for U.S. media outlets in China. So to enable English-speaking people to have a direct sense of what the Chinese are talking about, I think that helps them understand what the Chinese are thinking, what kind of world, what kind of country they envision for themselves. I think first and foremost, the Chinese have their eyes focused on one thing, and that is basically to make the lives for the Chinese people better. It's not about kicking the U.S. out of the center stage of the world. One of the key differences I've come to understand from the U.S. perception of the Chinese objective so far is that many people, especially people in the strategic communities, believe the Chinese really want to become the next hegemon of the world. And I sincerely don't agree with that. And I think China is a developing country. Well, people will say, you have all the high-speed trains. Why do you say that you are still a developing country? Well, the GDP per capita of the People's Republic of China is still like $13,000 US, which is 70th in World Bank ranking. It's still not a very rich country. There is still a lot domestically that the Chinese government can do, and they are trying to do it, whether to provide, better healthcare and more affordable prices. I think that's the sort of thing that the Chinese government, as well as the Chinese people, who are really interested in. Yes, with the growth of the Chinese economy, with the sort of global influence China gets from its development of its economy, it seems that China is trying to vie for some sort of bigger role globally. There have been very different reactions, but I think first and foremost, the strategic posture, that's something needs to be made more clear. I think one of the things that I try to highlight through not just publicizing what the Chinese government says, but also shedding significant light on the challenges facing China, whether it's the insufficient demand powering the domestic economy, or the lackluster productivity in the agricultural sector, low productivity at state-owned enterprises, and market-oriented reforms that Chinese scholars are trying to push forward. The fundamental challenge I think the Chinese people face is about, if my child gets sick, can he or she get proper medical care at one of the hospitals? And if my son or my daughter graduates from college, will he be able to find a relatively good job, preferably at a big city, and then afford an apartment in one of these cities? I think these are the questions that the Chinese leaders and also the Chinese people keep thinking about on a daily basis. But of course, the Chinese believe we have our own national interests to defend, like territorial integrity. And I think China, as a developing country and as a leader of the global South, somehow also feels like the existing international structure, the order, is not constructed in a way that would be conducive for these latecomers. I think it's true that China, as well as many other global South countries, they want to have significant reforms to the way that the world keeps running, and to have more tools and facilities that could help these now relatively poor countries grow up. For example, there is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is headquartered in Beijing, and they have been lending a lot of money to developing countries. And the biggest recipient of AIIB is actually India. Initiatives like AIIB and others trying to provide badly needed infrastructure funding for a lot of countries that are typically overlooked by the existing Western financial markets. And I'm not saying China is like a saint. It does no wrong. No, it's not like that. China is just another country on earth. China also has politics. The Chinese officials, when they make policies, they also have not just the national interests on their mind. They have their own, bureaucratic incentives. China faces its own problems, corruption and insufficiencies and lack of competition in some industries. Maybe I just want to show that, despite the different language, the different political system, China is just another different country.
What do Chinese people think about the United States right now?
For the past months, people are enormously interested in what's happening politically in the United States. And in particular, when it comes to U.S. policy on China, what is President Donald Trump thinking, and what is his senior advisors on China, his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, what are they thinking? And are they on the same channel? Or maybe President Trump is thinking one thing and maybe his national security team and the foreign policy team is having something else on their mind. So how will they resolve their differences? Will they be able to reconcile their different thinkings? Because I think so far there seems to be some sort of mixed signal. President Trump has said repeatedly on TV that he likes the Chinese leader a lot and they are friends. He has been having interesting, wonderful discussions with his Chinese counterpart. He would welcome Chinese companies to come here to make investment in the United States. But on the other hand, the White House released, national security investment memo, which, if you read it, actually try to restrict Chinese investment into the United States. So are the Chinese and the new administration actually talking? How many times have they talked? The U.S. is, without any question, the superpower in the world. If the U.S. adds 10% more on Chinese exports to the U.S., that would cause consequences for the Chinese exporters, for the Chinese manufacturing companies. And also, U.S. universities continue to be like a big attraction for Chinese parents who would like to send their children to these U.S. higher education institutions. If this administration reinstalls some sort of initiative that probably targets people with Chinese mainland background, what kind of effect will that have on the Chinese students here, on the Chinese professors here? So a lot of very difficult and complex questions people are asking. And I can't deny that people are also like as if they are watching a show here. There's some sort of theater in the town called Washington, D.C., because everything is indeed changing so much. I think the Chinese, including many serious professionals, they gave a lot of respect. They gave a lot of deference to President Donald Trump. They believe he, as now a second-term president, surrounded by very competent officials and advisors and billionaires, he must have some sort of grand strategy, or he is really thinking through all these issues. So that makes understanding the mixed signals very difficult. I've come to realize that many people here in the United States, especially people who are relatively Democratic Party or liberal leaning, perhaps would disagree with the Chinese assumption that President Trump thought out, a comprehensive strategy before saying something on TV or signing an executive order. Maybe in a few more months, we'll get to understand the new U.S. policy on China. I think the Chinese people have also observed senior U.S. officials like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, despite that they have said what the Chinese consider to be hawkish remarks on China before coming to the office, seem to be very professional. And he's speaking about China in a very respectful way. And it's like these are two very big countries, and China is becoming stronger, and there is very little that the U.S. could do to stop that, so they need to find a way to coexist in the world. I think these are all the words that the Chinese could perfectly understand, and for the two countries to have their relationships on a relatively stable footing, that's a good thing.
What do people in China and the U.S. need to understand about each other?
I think the Chinese need to understand that not every decision that the U.S. government or Congress makes or not everything that happens in the United States is because of China or targeted at China. And not every decision happening in China or by Beijing is actually targeted at the United States. It's like, I think big powers, being they are, have this sort of obsession with themselves. It's like, I'm the big boy in town, so everything must revolve around me. And I think that's not very helpful. There are perhaps some core interests that one side really wants the other side to respect. Like from the Chinese mainland point of view, like Taiwan is one of the things. It absolutely cannot tolerate crossing its red lines, for example, in terms of formalizing or pushing forward for de jure independence of Taiwan. And from the U.S. perspectives, it also has many of its own interests. It can't allow any sort of undue foreign influence into its domestic election. And for the Chinese to respect the U.S. territorial integrity and its own free speech, its own laws on its university campuses, and in its own public discourse. It's like some sort of mutual respect. I know there are difficult challenges in the U.S. China relations, but at the same time, there is also a lot of room for cooperation. Over the past 40 years, there are a lot of win-win cooperation between the China and the United States, and many of these common interests have been taken for granted, so that people just seem to be forgetting about it. A successful example of cooperation in cancer drug development, where one big U.S. firm makes a drug, but patients with that cancer concentrate in East Asia, particularly in the Chinese mainland. So if they can conduct the clinical trials in the Chinese mainland, it would help accelerate the approval process of that drug. And that actually happened. So the cost of developing the drug was lowered, and many more lives would be saved in time. If you really pursue a path of de-risking or maybe even decoupling, there will be big cost to both the Chinese factories as well as to American consumers. So I think if people really think about it and let the companies, let the individuals, just for their own profit, for their own very selfish interests, to find a way to work with one another, that would actually create a lot of synergies that would bind the two people, the two markets, the two nations together.